Yeah. 6:30. Yeah.
Das ist toll.
Yeah.
Das ist toll.
Das ist toll. Okay, it's 6:30. Thank you all for coming. It means a lot to us. So what we'll do today with Nicola, I'll give you a kind of overview of the project and how it came into being. And then Nicola, I've invited her to reflect on the key concept of the book, the concept of untimeliness, and give it a kind of bringing it even up to date till today. Let me begin. All my work tends to be a little bit autobiographical. So I laugh to say that it has taken me 30 years to figure out Yale. So when I first came here in 1992, I was terrified to see these buildings. And when I saw the date on the Yale Law School, 1930, I think the correct date is actually 32, I was like, what is wrong with the Americans? From the European perspective, you think America is the country of the future. I mean, that's how it was always portrayed also in the modernist literature. But what I found instead was this preoccupation with tradition, for example. So, and reflecting on names and books that I've encountered across these years, the book is really a summation, a narration through these strange temporal constructs that started to populate American architectural discussion in, kind of from the 30s, 40s onwards, all the way till the 70s when I end my story. Among these strange temporal constructs, among others that I discuss in the book, the idea of temporal duration, that I credit to Henri Focillon, the great formalist art historian. I'll elaborate on him. The concept shape of time, pretty strange stuff. Presence of the past, Paul Weiss, something that also Louis Kahn picked up on. Strange stuff, past being present, time having shape or duration. And then even in a broader architectural conversation, people who, had a strong presence and visited Yale frequently, the idea of future of the past was something that I also encountered, as well as the idea of usable past. And then lastly, a concept that comes up in the title of Siegfried Gideon's famous book, Space, Time and Architecture, the concept of new tradition. Like, how can tradition be new? So all these temporal constructs, the book is really it's about Yale on one hand, but it's also about this wider architectural conversation that started to take place here, but also elsewhere, that started to look at time, architecture as a medium of time, as a medium that can bend time, reshape time, and make time even weird. So I always said this book is about time weirding. This particular thing about America, like I said, I think this American discovery of tradition that started to happen sometime in the late teens and in the 20s. This is a time that Americans started to build museums, started to be really preoccupied with past, was also something kind of brings the kind of story, the Yale story, into a bigger picture. I discovered this guy, Barwick Brooks, who wrote an essay, very influential essay called The Usable Past in 1918. He was a Harvard guy, classmate of T.S. Eliot. And he was one of these people who started to say, history shouldn't be just, something factual, but everybody reads history very intentionally, that one should read history with intention, read it for the benefit of the present. something, you read it for what you can use. And same thesis was echoed by T.S. Eliot, a classmate, in the, I think, well-known essay called Traditional Individual Talent, where he too talks about that we are not reading past for its own sake. We are looking it for what we can make of it. He talks about that historical sense involves a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but its presence. So these are very important messages that they send also to artists, that you should look at history, but not only for the history's sake, but for the sake of what you can make out of it, what you can use. So this idea of usable past is something very important at this particular historical moment when I start my story. So then the untimely business, that also became, it kind of started to give a bigger umbrella to my kind of localized story. And there's also a little personal anecdote. I encountered the word untimely first when I was working on Eero Saarinen. We did this big exhibition project about 10 years ago. And people often refer to his death as being untimely. And I asked my husband, Turner, I said, why do they use this term untimely? Why do they call his death untimely and not premature? And he, having studied history at Yale College and a good liberal art education, he started to sprout Shakespeare out of his mouth. He said, oh, it's Shakespeare. Shakespeare coined the term. And he quoted the famous phrase, time is out of joint. You know, this sort of sense that time is not linear, that things can happen in different ways. People can, like he says, time travels in diverse paces with diverse person. The idea that time is not linear, it's not synchronic, but things can happen in kind of out of ordinary. And Nietzsche, of course, popularized the term and brought it to 20th century. He translated the term Unzeitgemäßigkeit, and he too was interested in looking at, asked the question, very interesting question, I think also for everybody around the table, like why should a modern person study history in the first place? Like what's the point? We are living in the present. Why should one bother with history? And he said the only right way to study history is that you use it to understand that things could go differently. You use it, again, you read it for the benefit of the present, for life. And having that historical perspective allows you to kind of question even the present events. So again, reading history from the perspective and for the benefit of the present was what the message that Nietzsche sent to also to modern architects like Le Corbusier, like Mies van der Rohe. They all read Nietzsche and they started to look at history with these eyes for the benefit and for the perspective of the present. So Nicola will probably elaborate on this, but one the story is really celebrates kind of interdisciplinary conversation surrounding time. Philosophers, art historians, artists, architects, all conversing around this sort of about the modern's relationship to time. A key figure, also particularly in the Yale context, was Henri Focillon, a historian who came from Sorbonne to Yale to teach at Yale in the early 30s. Art historian, and he was kind of single-handedly introduced kind of art historical formalism into Yale. And this is a very important sentence, what he says in this book. And actually, it's one of the first books that I bought when I came to Yale. You know, one of these things, it was republished by Zone Books in 1992. So I grabbed it. Of course, it's taken 30 years to really understand it. That usually happens. But this idea, look at the second sentence. He says, we have no right to confuse the state of the life of forms with the state of social life. the artist inhabits a country in time that is by no means necessarily the history of its own time. So what he's saying is that art, the history of time, that it's not synchronic. You know, what happens in history doesn't translate to, you know, to art. That art operates in its own time frame. Forms survive. They have an afterlife. And I think all of us who study precedents and who understand that, you know, columns have existed, topologies have existed throughout the millennia, can understand what he was saying, that we should not make a one-to-one correspondence between historical events and artistic events. Very important message. Another book, and it's too bad Alec Purvis is not here because he gifted me this book, The Shape of Time, by George Kubler, who was a student of Focillon and taught here, I think, all the way, maybe even into the early 90s. But this idea of the shape of time. And he was very important. He introduced this idea that basically he says, everything made now is either a replica or variant of something made a little time ago. It's a fantastic idea. And during this research, actually we were teaching a course with Nicola on Focillon and Kubler. And Kubler's daughter attended or audited the class. And I learned from her that Eero Saarinen was Kubler's classmate at Yale, class of 1934. And apparently they were very good friends and kept in touch in later years. And look at what Eero Saarinen says about his arch. He says, the gateway arch seemed like a sort of modern adaptation of a Roman triumphal arch. And look what he draws behind his own arch. All these different variants, modern arches, Roman arches, Maya bridges, and he said basically my arch is part of this longer series. Totally interesting take on, again, art historical thesis. This is an interesting guy. I mean, the book is really a kind of intellectual group biography of sorts. That I discovered, this guy called Paul Weiss. Peter, did you ever encounter Paul Weiss?
No.
Yeah. So he was kind of a superstar philosopher, blockbuster lectures, and he was really into metaphysics at the time when everybody else was doing kind of analytical philosophy. He would write articles called Eternity. I don't know if anyone would get away with that type of topics today. But he was also very involved with the architecture school, frequent visitor, and spoke and wrote about architecture being a medium of time. And this is Yale Daily provided great resource material, but here he criticizes modern architects by being suffering from kind of a temporal amnesia. And he is quoted saying, Professor Weiss asserted that architecture must incorporate the past, present, and future. So he was really a big advocate that architecture is really a medium of time, a medium that makes us understand the passing of time. And he continues to write that architecture is determined by the past. Almost more than any other enterprise, it makes us use the past and tries to achieve a release from it. So he really kind of problematizes all these sort of layers of time that architecture can reveal. And guess who was his friend? Louis Kahn was totally mesmerized and kind of started, if you ever wondered Louis Kahn's weird kind of cryptic metaphysical talk, it comes from Paul Weiss. They all started to talk about weird, look at this, the two quotes. So Louis Kahn, what was has always been. What is has always been. What will be has always been. This is Louis Kahn in 1972. But Weiss in 1945 had already said every existence has a past. All have come to be. Every existence has its effect on future. All make some difference to what will be. So this is the way that they start conversing, and there's a kind of a Denkstil and a way of talking. Also, I've seen this big perspective of the British Art Centre early sketch by Louis Kahn for that main space on the second floor. And I never noticed until I was working on this book, and look what he has hanging on the wall. Not the stuffed zebras and lions, but buildings and drawings that he made in Italy. And I think this is the Casale Monferrato that he's studying the ribs of this building, and you can tell how he makes the analogy to his own building. Also, I discovered actually only when I was in Yale, I was not really familiar with the work of Josef and Anni Albers, but here, of course, the legacy of their legacy is big. And if you look at just this sort of sampling of their work, photographs of the Inca monuments by Josef and Anni's weavings, you can see their kind of like almost like a Kublerian take on forms and how they have these sort of afterlives. And look at also what Anni writes. She's a beautiful writer, and has written extensively about weaving, which is of course tellingly a very old art form. He writes beautifully, beginnings are usually more interesting than elaborations and endings. Going back to the beginning, and he dedicates actually her book on weaving to my great teachers, the weavers of ancient Peru. This interest in going back to the beginnings, analyzing the medium, the main components of the medium, is very much what she wanted to communicate also to the future generations, that you have to go to the past to learn to innovate. That's the kind of beginning, that's where you start. And then, of course, poor Rudolph, coming to this building for the first time, I had no way, again, of processing this weird architecture, this plaster cast on the walls. There was I had no tools as a kind of my husband would call me like a kind of a European modernist doctrinaire. What is this about? If you look at even just the way that he hangs them, and it's interesting because Yale had a big tradition about the museum. We have one of the oldest university art museum in the country. And this idea that art students and architecture students should go and to the museum, while they create, they should go. So what is interesting about Paul Rudolph, that he brought these old relics from the art gallery to the building so that the students could, while they work, would kind of inhabit this sort of great polychromatic ensemble and getting inspired. He's also somebody, I think there's a kind of an anti-modernist strain in the book. Paul Rudolph was very adamant, actually when he gave his inaugural speech when he became a dean at the School of Architecture. He's basically said that modern architecture is really bad, that it has never been on the lower point. So can you imagine what message that sent to the students? And he also writes, he goes to Rome and he said, this is 1952, he says, with notable exceptions, I was impressed much more by the great architecture of the past than by the contemporary efforts. So he travels in Europe, he goes to see modern architecture for the first time, and he comes to the conclusion that the old stuff is much better than the 20th century stuff. And this is the message that he communicated with his student. I pair him with Sibyl Moholy-Nagy, who is a super interesting, actually self-taught historian, the wife of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. And she is also a super interesting figure. She really already way before Rudolph, or quite a lot, she starts to study the kind of non-pedigree architecture. That was, of course, one way to say that modern architecture is not on the right track, that we should study not only historical architecture, but also vernacular architecture, that they are much more. And look at also what she says, totally interesting. So the purpose of living is strictly non-progressive. So basically she says that the idea that we should come up with the machine for living and all this sort of new stuff is total nonsense, because people live and the basic needs that they have for living have stayed the same throughout the years. So the idea of non-progressiveness is totally interesting. And finally, the final chapter is dedicated to Scully. Again, a little bit autobiographical note. When I first came, I went to one of his lectures. I thought the guy was complete nuts. I remember he put on the screen, he had two projectors. This is before the PowerPoint. So one showed the Venturi house and the other one was Mayan temple. And somehow there was a relationship with them. And I was like, what the heck, this doesn't make any sense. But for him, it was because they shared the triangle. So this is a totally formalist stance. And I dug more into his writings, and it is really interesting. I mean, he writes a lot. He was, of course, not a direct student, but was really under influence of Focillon and Kubler. And he's very interested in precedents and the idea that architects, all the good architects, have studied history. And of course, he, befriends and becomes very influenced by Harold Bloom's thesis, the idea that all great artists, poets have to wrestle with I think that's the word that they wrestle with the predecessors, that you can't be good unless you take on the precursors. You have to wrestle with them. He uses the word. It's very sad. I went actually to see Harold Bloom, and I wanted to interview him and about their relationship with Scully, and he said, "Come back in a few weeks," and then he died. So I missed the opportunity, but I got little confirmation that they had frequent conversations. So Scully's book that came out only a year after that kind of picks up and references Bloom's idea of strong poet who wrestled with the precursors. Again, a kind of funny temporal reference in the title. So Shingle Style Today, Venturi below, Stearns and Peabody above, and the subtitle Historian's Revenge, because he felt that now, the historian has taken over. And it was kind of interesting also because the superstar on campus was Vincent Scully, the historian, not so much the architect. So I think that was also a telling aspect of the talks. And I don't know, maybe Nicola can take over, but also, in the postscript, I'm kind of a little bit touch on this because what was more interesting for me, couple things. Is he really wrestling with the past? I think there was a big faux pas when Stern said that the Gothic is in the DNA of Yale, when Gothic is so much associated with Anglo-Saxon tradition. So I think the DNA comment was very unfortunate. Also fascinating is that nobody paid too much attention when the Sterling Library, when the students revolted. They were very upset about the Gothic stuff, young students, but nobody cared, and in fact the students wanted that stuff, so that was kind of interesting. And then finally I thought that this was very moving. Just when I was completing the book, the Met-mounted Afrofuturist period room. And I think this is also kind of interesting, maybe ending this idea that instead of, again, museums just putting historical objects on display, that you may have to wrestle with the past and reimagine the past. which was the message of the curators at that time, that they chose not to just reimagine, not reimagine.
Because it's futuristic.
Yeah. No, so I think that was a kind of interesting revelation also, that kind of in the Nietzschean sense, that we don't just like visit the past, but we have to kind of see it with the new eyes from the perspective of the present. Anyway, and that's the outline.
Can you go to your cover
Yeah.
image?
So now Nicola will respond.
So I take over. When Eeva-Liisa asked me if I want to respond to her book, Untimely Modern, How 20th Century Architecture Reimagined the Past, I immediately agreed, although I'm neither scholar of the 20th century nor architecture. But I have taught with Eva two related courses, one on Focillon and Kubler and one on style, and have seen over these years of our friendship this important and highly inspiring book come beautifully together. Being myself a scholar of early modern European painting, I nevertheless can relate to the very last word of the title, the past. Eeva-Liisa's book is impressive in many respects. It is a beautiful, written, abundantly illustrated, deeply informed, and thought-provoking historical study on Yale School of Architecture as an intellectual center between the years of the 1920s to the 1970s, as you have seen. It makes every of her protagonists, and there are many, alive and meaningful in her account. Some of these are quite famous, others less known, but Eva treats them all alike. Their voices and works are put in such intriguing dialogue with those of their colleagues that Yale shines like an intellectually highly stimulating and this ideal context, a place to be at that very moment. Her huge area of figures and the later social network that built the collective of thinkers defines Yale as a social cultural locus that spread new ideas about pedagogy and architecture. As Eeva-Liisa explains, the common ground that drove them all together was their shared belief in aesthetic education and how architecture on campus could serve this goal. Eva combines meticulous archival research with a very big idea, the Untimely, that had, as Eva shows most evidently, its moment at Yale during these years. The decades under investigations are years that were marked by the loss of the meaning of history after the First and then again the Second World War. Eva demonstrates that at that moment, tradition gained a new momentum that contradicts the general perception of modernism as an epoch that comes after the end of historicism, where different styles were ordered, classified, and historized, and thus marked as bygone. The credo of the modernist tradition, to owe nothing to past tradition, is, I must say, as a scholar of Baroque art, a repetition of a modernist claim formulated in the 17th century when the term arte moderna, so modern art, appeared the first time. The painter Caravaggio boasted about his revolutionary realistic painting in the very same vein. But it would be simply ignorant to believe in the credo, because both modernisms are very much a forceful response to tradition. In his essay, Tradition and Individual Talent from 1990, T.S. Eliot writes, and I quote from Eva's book, the past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. And this has been true until historicism, when forms were codified, frozen, and even mummified, beginning with the end of the 18th century. Discovering affinities between stylistic elements of very different time and space zones, as we have seen, as taught by Vincent Scully, for instance, meant to break up the artificial boxes of that thinking and release the energy of forms again. Modernism is a critical response to historicism, and this critique is not, I say it as a Baroque expert, not applicable to the living tradition of the past that was always acting as Eliot described it. Accordingly, Henri Focillon, who taught at Yale, writes in general, history is not unilinear. It is not pure sequence. It is, in general, a conflict among what is precocious, actual, or merely delayed. Eva's book clarifies the importance of theoretical education at the School of Architecture in these very years, especially with regard to the concept of the untimely. Two very prominent representatives whose teaching were highly relevant are the philosopher Paul Weiss and the architectural historian Siegfried Gideon. Paul Weiss wrote, architecture seeks to achieve a present in the face and against the dreck of the past. Architecture in particular is determined by the past, whereas Siegfried Gideon states in Space, Time and Architecture, the growth of the new tradition, the backward looks transforms its object. Every spectator, at every period, at every moment indeed, inevitably transforms the past according to its own nature. The cover of her book, showing the Sterling Memorial Library on a photo from 1929 that has its own patina, is a great pic. It shows a building that looks antiquated under construction. The building in that very moment becomes a representative of untimely modern, as its unfinished state exemplifies the untimely dimension of its very foundation. It is the belief that there exists a hidden potential buried in the past that was not fully realized in its time, but promising a new beginning. And as Eva demonstrates in her book, it was the Gothic style that was charged with that promise from the late 18th century on. But we might wonder as well if the Gothic campus was not considered outdated from the beginning of its construction. The word untimely implies that something has, as we say in German, I think this is not in English terms, it has fallen out of time. And this falling out of time has two dimensions. First, and most obviously, it has fallen out of contemporaneity. But more importantly, it must have landed somehow on a different stratum of time that was not actually given, but virtually possible at that very moment. The concept of untimely considers the simultaneous existence of many time strata that are shaken up and allow certain breakthroughs in moment of crisis, where one's own time doesn't provide a ground for meaningful existence. In the very sense of Walter Benjamin, who writes in his essay on the concept of history, 1942, to articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it was. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. The danger affects both the content of the tradition and its receivers. End quote. The philosophical notion of untimely does not suspend time as untimely might suggest, but deepens it by creating a critical counterfoil that opens up a path for the future. Nietzsche, one of Eva's references for the concept of untimely, states, "I do not know what meaning classical studies could have for our time if they were not untimely." This is to say, acting counter to our time, and thereby acting on our time, and let us hope for the benefit of a time to come. End quote. We might say that untimely as a figure of thought is applicable to many epochs, and this is true, I can tell you. But it was conceived in the 20th century by different intellectuals. With Untimely Moderns in her main title, Eva gestures not only to Nietzsche's untimely meditations that she cites, but also to Bruno Latour's "We Have Never Been Modern." I would like to expand, with some quotes, the historical framework of Eva's historical study to highlight the timeliness of Eva's historical account of the untimely moderns at Yale. For the late 20th century, untimely is not a sophisticated choice of a critical stance, as in Nietzsche, but defines the very condition of time in general, the condition we might not be aware of. In his essay, Morality and Technology, The End of the Means, Bruno Latour writes, "The hammer that I find on my workbench is not contemporary to my action today. It keeps folded heterogeneous temporalities. When I grab the handle, I insert myself in a garland of time." And with this metaphor of the garland, he refers to Michel Serres, who, in the published conversations with Latour, mocks the general conception of time as follows. I quote, "I cannot help thinking that this idea, so the concept of time as irreversible line, is the equivalent of those ancient diagrams we laugh at today, which places the Earth at the center of everything, or our galaxy at the middle of the universe to satisfy our narcissism. Just as in space, we situate ourselves at the center, at the navel of the things in the universe, so for time, through progress, we never cease to be at the summit, on the cutting edge, at the state of the art of development. This is not time, only a simple line. It is not even a line, but a trajectory of the race for the first place. This isn't time, but a simple competition. More profoundly, time alone can make possible two contradictory things." End quote. For Serres, time percolates and would need a theory of turbulence to be better understood because, I quote, "every historical era is likewise multi-temporal, simultaneously drawing together from the obsolete, the contemporary, and the futuristic." End quote. Although we encounter in every area of our life this multifaceted splitting of the dimension of time, it is the realm of art and architecture that gives its appearance a platform and thus awareness. Eeva-Liisa dedicated a whole chapter of her intellectual history of Yale to the French immigré and art historian Henri Focillon, who defined the work of art on the one hand as the translation of a free and exalted dream, and on the other as the flowing together of the energies of many civilizations, with the conclusion that a work of art is immersed in the whirlpool of time. Focillon describes this whirlpool as follows. I quote from Eva, "A kind of fissure through which crowds of images aspiring to birth may be introduced into some indefinitive realm, a realm that is neither that of physical extent nor that of pure thought." End quote. The creative impetus is thus not tied to a blank page, a tabula rasa, like modernism wants it, but to a black hole that absorbs the gravity of different times to actualize their potential for the future. Focillon's question, can form then be nothing more than a void, is famously taken up by his student Georges Kubler, who figures prominently in chapter 6 of Untimely Moderns. He answers Focillon's intellectual occupation with what actuality is with the following definition. Actuality is when the lighthouse is dark between flashes. It is the instant between the ticks of the watch. It is a void, interval, slipping forever through time. The rupture between past and future, the gap of the poles of the revolving magnetic field, infinitesimal small but ultimately real. It is the interchronic pause when nothing is happening. It is the void between events. Interestingly, Kubler is trying here to inscribe Focillon's void into his own attempt to structure the shape of time in sequential groups, but at the same time falls short, because this is, with it, he attempts to cut the maelstrom into pieces and thus disregards its resistance to be spread out horizontally. It is not one other layer that shows through, but a rupture that's breakthrough. Against the causality or teleology of chronology that divides time into sequences, the model of deep and absorbing time offers a mesmerizing perspective that draws us to the eye of the storm as its vanishing point. And this eye is form in its capacity to crystallize deep time. I want to come back again to Michel Serres, the most prominent contemporary thinker of the Untimely, because in his book, The Incandescent, he refigures the concept of deep time by turning from the geographic metaphor of strata to geology itself, to embed the time of human being into the grand narrative of that history, defining it as a space where all things and elements flow, even stir. I quote, thinking we are busying ourselves in a stable space, we mortals daily weave, weft, and walk from the ephemeral to the ancient, the slow of lightning fast, drawing a few fleeting lines on the billion-year tapestry. Space then appears as a maquetry of time, and he declares, we are almost as old as the earth. And once again, he develops his thoughts as a critique of a false perception. I quote, we thought the grand narrative to be linear and only directed towards us, as though we are playing the role of the goal and end of all things. Taking the concept of the Untimely serious and looking from our days back to the thinkers at Yale of the last century, we must ask ourselves what is still timely and relevant and what outdated. It looked like Focillon's whirlpool is still spinning, but should we not be wary of the utilitarian perspective of capitalism that shines through in many thinkers of that period? And do we need Vincent Scully's and Tara Bloom's strongman rhetoric? Has not the very idea of the collective style and the account that Eva has given us in her magnificent book shown that intelligence can only thrive when shared? And shouldn't we be humbly aware that we are not only part of human history, but also of the grand narrative, and thus should care more for the history of nature in our education? Yeah, with this I was thinking it's really useful to think. So this is really a very important moment, and when you read it, you think you want to be at that moment at Yale, but we are all here in the moment at Yale, and maybe there's something that you can draw out of it to make it also such a historical moment.
Yeah.
But clearly, I'm different. We have a different mindset, I think, today.
No, it is. Thank you. This was a very, very beautiful response. But it's also, I think, interesting. Like you said, I had big idea of the book, but the ideas that they tackled, that was so big, and sometimes, we, kind of like, what are the big ideas? But
Yes.
no, but definitely that there was this sort of cumulative intelligence that tackled these big questions was quite amazing.
And I think what you said also in your presentation, and I was also referring to, is the concept of Denkstiel that comes from Ludwig Fleck, who was saying that kind of we do not come to certain really the solutions of certain problems or certain ideas if we are not in constant exchange. So, and what then is produced is something that is produced in between us, and I think this is a very beautiful idea that.
No, it's interesting because we actually, my editor from Yale Press is here, Catherine, but we had this long debate about whether to have Yale at the title, and I kind of resisted it because it is about Yale, but it's kind of, I already said it. It's about these bigger conversations that actually percolated, beyond Yale. But there's something. I remember when I was a PhD student at Columbia, my advisor, Gwendolyn Wright, asked me to read a book called The New York Intellect by Thomas Bender. It's actually her then husband, a historian, NYU historian. And it's interesting because it makes the kind of same argument that New York had a particular kind of intellectual culture, talks about John Dewey and, these people being there kind of around the same time that when I start the story in the 20s. But this sort of idea that the particular place, that ideas are also, that there's kind of a biotope, that ideas are grounded in place and fostered through place, that they are not just like in the air or in the libraries, but that there's a kind of intellectual culture that grounded in place. And not that, a lot of the characters didn't really live here all their lives, so they were not born here, that's beyond the point, but that there's a kind of a intellectual kind of place here that I think I do really believe in that. I remember I also like when I was in Graz, working in Graz, that there's a kind of something to these places that foster interaction between people and communication that is something to be celebrated.
So we open the floor.
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you so much to Eeva-Liisa and Nicola for the wonderful sharing conversation. I guess my question has to do then with the totalizing power of time and of course how it's constructed, how it is disseminated through this massive monumental visual cultures that we have been discussing for the evening. And I'm really curious about then of the notion of translations, because you were framing it and for example between, let's say, the kind of German tectonics of what time can be versus how it has been disseminated through English literature, and you also talked a little bit about the French coinage of the modern. And I'm really curious as to whether there were interpretations or misinterpretation that resulted in this kind of different translocations of how time could be across different, either it could be epistemes or just in attitude. And I'm really also then curious about to what extent have these thinkers that you have highlighted, taken in their theories the idea of time, temporality, chronology from other cosmological systems, from maybe indigenous world systems or, from East Asia or from then they would call it the Orient, the kind of intellectual genealogy that goes beyond a very specific Western post-Enlightenment tradition. Thank you. Sorry, it was very long and I don't know what punctuation is.
Yeah. No, definitely there's a kind of opening up and questioning that begins with, again, if people came from certain intellectual culture and posed questions and used languages and theoretical frameworks that were familiar to them. But I think the kind of opening up and the questioning itself, was significant, of its time. And I think also like ideas, but kind of these metaphysical ideas that clearly there was something like, that we can't even grasp, that Western rationality can't grasp. These were, I think, also maybe openings, that provided that,
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and I would say kind of what I kind of presented with Michel Serre. So he would be much more kind of so critical about the Western conception of time, at least explicitly as such, and says it has not to be bound to cultural time but to nature time, so to speak. And I think this is a huge move that at the same time, because when he says, well, I'm as old as the earth, then it means also what is an I, so the whole concept of culture and of what I see, kind of, and this is my, would my, not to the book, but if I would speak with these thinkers, I would think that they think they own the time, in a certain way, that can go back and get it or so in a certain way, appropriate the time and make it useful. So the whole concept of usefulness is also, even if Scully was comparing these different cultures and showed kind of a global perspective, nevertheless he did it from a certain positionality, and I think this we would criticize today. I think what Misha Serre is arguing for is a more humble perspective, that we are always kind of more a product of time than having time, so to speak, right? So and that we are conscious of it, and there's a different responsibility. So I think there is, and I think this is what is asked for at this very moment, so that we kind of question how can we open it, and at the same time have something like consider kind of these big topics like that.
It's also interesting about the, these sort of cosmological metaphors come up actually with Kubler a lot. He talks about like, that if you think of history, it's like it's like a galaxy, like all these things. So I think this sort of idea also that it's kind of like non-human centered, that they start to use these metaphors, that are kind of like the time is not measured by humans or human technologies, that there's something bigger, cosmological, also this sort of oceanic time, that it's liquid, time is kind of like ocean. So I think that also is kind of interesting opening, to new ways of thinking about time.
You were kind of talking about would you still think that this is like this strong that we have, that is still the case? Because for me, it's actually kind of funny when I started here. I think it's the exact opposite. Like in Swiss, I was kind of dedicated to always reference past, and he is very modernistic. So, is it just like my experience so far here, or would you say this is actually?
Or like today?
Yeah, today.
No, I think it's an interesting observation. I think like at this time, one of the big conversation was like how to teach history to architecture students, and they came up with all sorts of ideas that it's good to actually that like they said architecture students should learn history so that they don't think that all that matters is what is today, and then historians should study also studio so that they don't get stuck with history. So they were really into this type of, and they also said it's actually beneficial if architectural practitioners teach history, So they really tried to kind of bridge the gap. And I think in today's, our curricula, I think I would say if I would critique it, it suffers from that, history is here, it's like PowerPoints in dark room, and then there's the fun stuff in studio. And they, even when we talk about studying presidents, we don't really kind of have a good reason. It's kind of like, okay, you do theater, you should study theater. But those guys, they really kind of problematized the idea, like why should an architect or artist, for that matter, to study history? And it was a very kind of vital conversation around that subject, and maybe we don't have that. So the student might be confused, Yeah, so good question, observation.
I just want to expand a little bit on the previous question, simply because there's been literature lately on the topic, and my impression, even from my personal work, is that the distinction between West and non-West has been done way too sharply, and it is in many ways artificial. And I happened myself to see many times, 1500s Europeans discussing problems related to cosmological time by commenting the works of a Persian Muslim who in turn based his cosmology on a Greek that lived 2000 years earlier. And this is not an exception. This is really how it worked. It was really much more complex and magmatic and circulating that we tend to define it these days. And I really hear often this question of, okay, but what about non-Western cosmologies and Western thoughts on these topics? On time, on the age of the Earth, of the cosmos, was imbued with non-Western ways of thinking since the Middle Ages. and no one made a problem about it. Maybe the artificial distinction was elaborated later in colonial times in order to justify some European superiority, but it has no historiographical basis, documentary basis, and I'm glad that Nicola brought up Sears, because I think this is right. What he says actually can be, it is not just a philosophical elaboration, but I mean, it is true on an empirical basis, it can be documented. This magmatic ocean that flows of knowledge, this time of nature that transcends the times of culture. It has a documentary basis, in my opinion.
Yeah, please.
One of the first places my mind goes is Walter Benjamin and his sort of messianic conception of history. The idea that I'm not sure anyone really quite understands what he was after, but he, had the sense that there was something latent in experiences of the past that could be revived for the benefit of mankind, essentially. And he even goes as far, especially in thinking of the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, as talking about popular culture and the ways in which there can be a relationship between this very esoteric perspective on history and something that's actually tangible about popular experience. And if it's not too big a leap, I'm interested in the way that this thinking within intellectual and particularly academic circles about the past may relate to what was happening in popular culture and its perspective on the past and middle of the middle 20th century. I mean, the great collectors, particularly of decorative arts, the people invested in architectural preservation, practitioners of the colonial revival at a more vernacular level, all of them were swept up in this excitement, which was also tied with all sorts of social anxiety, and then set almost in a kind of interwoven configuration between scholarship and play and fun and social life. And I mean, I wonder to what extent this project extends or could be taken up by someone else to look at the ramifications of this untimeliness throughout society and artistic understanding and experience.
That would be a great topic. Or some film. Right, Francesco.
The Benjamin stuff is interesting. I mean, I discuss him in the Focillon chapter, and I mean these liquid metaphors like river and the idea of the origins, which in German has a liquid word, Ursprung, spring, and is what it entails. That time is kind of liquid, that it retains kind of all these remnants of the past and echoes. And the concept of aura, of course, is also kind of important. The idea that there's, every image has kind of an aura that brings forth, kind of springs forth other images is kind of important for him. So, and it is interesting, I think, in the light of today with the students, with their screens and inhabiting all these images, in a way that there's a kind of, even in one image, it contains and leads to another. So I think that sort of kind of proliferation of image is very much kind of in tune with, I think, what Kubler was interested in, and also kind of what Benjamin was interested in. So I think there's maybe contemporary culture is untimeliness on steroids, that's it.
Yeah, but I think it's a good project in a sense also that you can maybe trace a certain drive to it or kind of desire of it, so a need for it, although it is not written down, not discussed, in film or popular culture. And it would be interesting to see how kind of these references to past or kind of making sure to past does look in different epochs and what kind of this visual language tells us about the aspect of time and in that particular moment, so because we speak about potentiality, but it means that everything that is potential can be actualized. So what could be actualized in what time? So I think it's a great point.
Thank you for the presentation, Eeva-Liisa, and the wonderful response, Nicola. And I have to say I really enjoyed the book. And there's a lot I want to ask you about, especially because in the late 30s and early 40s, Yale is where Freud and behaviorist science kind of comes together and is synthesized in a very unusual way. When I table that history of science question for two that are more pertinent to architecture, one, in this idea of the usable past, I know, and citing T.S. Eliot started to put footnotes in poems because he was accused of plagiarism. So I'm curious about the role of authorship and the way that that's being debated. It's definitely foregrounded in your chapter with Harold Bloom and Scully, but I'm curious about the debates with authorship. And then the other question has to do with the canon, and maybe because of the formation of it and the way in which I guess our sisters and brothers in art history next door have stopped teaching that sequence, as I understand it. So I'm curious if that really is a kind of way, or is it more kind of in the way that when David Bowie asked John Lennon what he thought of his work, he said it's rock and roll just with lipstick. So is it really the same thing, just slightly changed, and the role of authorship that you explore in the book?
Yeah, I mean, they totally, there was a debate about how to do it right, it wasn't like, obviously you shouldn't copy, that was bad, you shouldn't do that. And they are kind of course, the answer with Scully is, he was, really into psychoanalysis and Jung and so forth. So he solved the problem by saying that all this stuff is kind of subliminal, that whether we don't have to be conscious. And he said that that's why you need a historian, because the architects are too stupid even to know what they are influenced by, that it's kind of in their, like we all like caves and, it's all there, kind of waiting to be percolating on the surface. So in a way that solved that problem. There was also like that sort of kind of like unconscious, they really were working through this idea, like what is the right way to use the past? How does it funnel into new work? Or Anni Albers, for that matter, they said, okay, you learn the techniques, you learn the rules of your medium, and then once you kind of laid out your chess set and chess, you start playing with those rules and tweaking them. So it was really kind of one of the key questions, that how does that historical knowledge channel into a creativity kind of, actually, again, historicism was not what they were after. Copying was not that, Beaux-Arts was not that, but this idea that it actually kind of fuels creativity in some new and unpredictable ways was something that they were really
and
looking closely.
Is there right and wrong then? So to choose right, that would be interesting, because we would then question that today, right?
Yeah.
So what is interesting then to think about the future. So I think there is more in Untimely than the vocabulary of possible languages that we can pick and choose. And it is relating to something like energy that is in the form and that we try to reach to stimulate it.
Risk on my Ralph. And when I was an undergrad, must have been around 70, I actually heard a joint lecture by Paul Weiss and Louis Kahn
Together.
together. And I had much the same reaction you did initially to Scully. What are these guys talking about? And I realized in retrospect that there was something of a generational divide around 1965, I'd say. Because what history was for Kahn and Weiss something metaphysical and mystical and archetypal, which it was for Vince, was not what history was for, say, Charles Moore and Robert Venturi. Much more playful, even arbitrary, and certainly in the broader sense, postmodern, as in novels there. So, am I totally off base?
And one thing that happens with Venturi and actually already with Rudolph, that they really start working with images, you know? And they would do these
Literal.
literal images, like they would say, you know, like the way that, so that is something that the proliferation of images, you can see how much that also influenced architecture culture, you know? You know, you would start to have like Rudolph did, I have it in the book, kind of whole, you know.
By the way, both of those guys went to Princeton.
So bad things come from Princeton. So one is kind of
I never made that claim.
right? So we take only the good things. So yeah, I think this is an interesting idea also because some of these thinkers, it looks like, and I mean even Focillon thinks of the universe of the arts as something like a second world next to our world, and what you say, so that this is also questionable and kind of. When we think of the universe as how is it constituted, and we are with the language and kind of so constructed. But it's good to feel something like something doesn't work for me, because then one can be conscious also kind of it, but in the very much sense of using the past as a counterfoil, from being more aware that this does not work of oneself and why is that? So I think this is also very much about humility. I think that there is also kind of shift of, a new epoch we are in, and you have to realize what this epoch is about. Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you for the conversation. So my question is, I think, thus far, the way I've been taught like how architectural history works is, or it works the best, is through this linear sense of antithesis. So you have the Renaissance and the Mannerists, you have the modern and postmodern, and I was just wondering,
That's the Baroque.
Yeah.
I'm a Baroque scholar.
Yeah, I think those are kind of like we put like at least how at least and how I was taught like history, that we put most importance into those periods of antithesis of history, and to go to your point of like untimely as a way of like falling out of time but landed on another period of time. So I guess my question is there, or what are the kind of the examples of periods of times where the architects realized that the whole total of history was in front of them, and that sort of, when realizing that entanglement of different streams of history can actually be usable? Like, is there examples of those architects referencing those entanglements of history instead of like these anti?
Well, the periodization question is interesting. It comes up with Focillon. They kind of reject it completely, like to create these periods is, just totally faulty premise,
That is true.
Yeah, it's an art story.
And one reason that they also said that, like the problem with, like, let's say when you teach periods, you often like isolate like the high moment of each style, like the high Renaissance or high Gothic, and said that styles don't work that way, that they have this whole duration, where you kind of do trials and errors, and it's like the Gothic period would be, and then they get mixed with the influences and so forth, so that they're much more they have a much more complex kind of evolutionary life, rather than this sort of mathematical moment where the thing is suddenly in full bloom. So they really, they dismantle, so it becomes much more by nature unpurified, So then it becomes very interesting when you have these moments of like late work or early periods where things are kind of in formation, and often products of, of multiple influences, like, Middle Ages would come from, a little bit of Byzantine, a little bit of, and it becomes more hybrid to begin with,
And maybe one can also think of, since you ask now how to react, I would say with intuition. so not with kind of putting something in boxes or kind of circumscribing it, but maybe more listening what is produced and trying to figure that out in a certain way. Because when we take it serious, what kind of this untimely modern concept in our days means that we are not at the center. We are kind of, so something is kind of processed through us. So and only when we are kind of giving intuition space or kind of time and space, then this can formulate, and we can kind of, so in a kind of in a reflexive react to it, see through it, and I think there kind of that might is something created that might as relate even to time, so a deep time that that we do not have conceptually, so in our hands, so that shows up. So I would say maybe that is a puzzle, but so.
Francesca and David.
Oh, okay. I'll go. First of all, thank you for two wonderful presentations. Your book brings to mind the idea that's often brought up in history that there's no secondary literature, right? Every historical study is in some sense like a reflection on its present. And sort of continuing in that logic, I'm wondering how you approached and defined your own position as a fellow time traveler, being transported to the past to join these protagonists, sort of in a shared historical space, and what contemporary perspectives were brought to bear on this study, specifically working within a moment of the so-called crisis of the humanities. There was an article in the Yale News, I think a week or two ago, about how STEM majors now outnumber humanities majors in college for the first time, right? And so sort of how you defined your own position. And then the book also brought to mind Rem Koolhaas's Delirious New York, oddly enough, in that it seemed as though potentially you're undertaking a sort of retroactive manifesto for the humanities, but with mid-century Yale as your site of study. So
I mean, a couple of things. I mean, obviously this is, there's a little bit of institutional history that I found quite appealing. I mean, first of all, this is a moment where arts are becoming brought into the center stage at the curricula. I mean, and now of course we are kind of like, here. You can hear that from Dean Burke. I think she gets that treatment a lot. And humanities in general, I was going to, add to Alan's comment that in the 50s, I think, was kind of interesting. I think one of the greatest presidents that Yale has had was Whitney Griswold. I mean, he was a great, was commissioned a lot of great architecture, but he also was the one who, came up with like directed studies and the idea. He has this great quote, I think I have it in the book, that the philosophy is the center and all other disciplines are like the stars that circulate, around that center. So I think the kind of humanities and arts. And then I think the kind of interdisciplinariness, I think now with that this was such a cross-disciplinary conversation that we don't have these silos, I think, that we have now settled so comfortably, So I think that is maybe the regular, that there is a kind of a little bit of and I love the metaphysical stuff, It's so weird. Like you read these things and you're kind of like, if I had written, like the way Scully wrote, about caves and God knows what, like
Americans on horseback and
would there be a
Cadillacs.
tenure inside? It's amazing. No footnotes and just crazy stuff. Focillon said, I don't write as a historian, I write as a poet, So I think that also like writing these weird genders, taking up these gargantuan topics is something kind of crazy and wonderful. Big ideas, so I don't like that. So sometimes you wonder where are the big ideas.
So thank you so much for the book and thank you so much for the presentation. I was looking at this image on the screen, which is a good example of the entanglement of the multi-temporalities we deal with. So we have a building which looks to the past, the cars which look to the future, and a tree which looks to the persistence of nature.
Yeah.
And then there is another temporality, the temporality of the University of the 30s, that is reflected in the building and not in the car and not in the in the tree, which is the look back at the culture, at our past, because it's the only capital we have, beyond the endowment, of course. And so it seems to me that, Eeva-Liisa, you put a great question, which is the question of alliances. Which kind of alliances every building is doing? Which kind of capital or which kind of object around is aligning? For, with the car, and of course, Le Corbusier would say the car, bien sûr, or with other. This is, to me, the question of the architecture. What kind of alliances an architecture must do?
What do you mean with alliance?
The fact that you make a connection with some temporality instead of another, and the architecture that we see there is ideologically explicating to the students that our capital is in the past, but in the meantime, any alliances means to make enemies. And it's true that 20 years later, the president you mentioned founded Directed Studies. He founded that in order to preserve the Western culture.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
So the system of alliances means also the system of enemies.
Oh, totally, yeah. No, and the Gothic, it was very much, I have a whole conversation about it, but there was this sort of, moment after the First World War, when there were a lot of new type of students came into and they were not necessarily welcome, so this was also kind of a machine to make good Yale's out of them.
Absolutely.
So, and this sort of Anglo-Saxon stuff was very much, very explicitly the racist commentary was attached to the hardliner Gothic, you know, that this is, the history will prove that the future belongs to us. I mean, this was some of the rhetoric. So when Bob Stern said that Gothic is in the DNA of Yale, it was, I think, a very bad thing to say.
If you are out of time, but if you are out of time, I understand. Thank you so much for the, I was really taken aback with this idea of architecture moving between past, present, and the future. And I was just trying to reflect upon this thing of, one is designing, like you were showing that one is designing by being influenced by the past, but through the sheer time that it takes to construct, that's the present, and it's being judged in the future for after it's being used. So it was just sort of, and then that leads to obsolescence and this whole cyclic nature of it being. Well, just two questions about it. Like, one is, how do you break away from this cyclic thing of you're designing at some moment, but designing for a very different world? And the second was especially about the judgment over time. While you're reflecting back or reading a building, which history of the many history that lives you recall? Because, like, for example, in this building, do you study the history of when it was constructed and all the negative feedback? Or do you study the building in today's time and all the positive, but and it might, like, each building might have a very different history.
No, those kind of realizations were actually used to make a case for this type of untimely moderns, that there's no point of fixing buildings by the date they were built, because they continue to live with us. There's a wonderful quotation that Kubler makes notes about Focillon. He said there are two types of historical facts, you know. There's, let's say, and I can't remember what example he uses, there's like a thing like, let's say, JFK assassination. We can put a date to it. It's a historical fact of very particular sort. But he says a building or a piece of art is a very different type of historical fact, exactly for the reasons that you just said. They continue to evolve and be part of our lives. So he makes a very clear differentiation what type of historical fact building or artwork is. So it's very good comment. Should we
any other urgent questions?
But we can linger around for a while.